Before we start, there's a whole library of exclusive content you're missing out on. Patreon only, nowhere else. Link in the description. Okay, on to the video. The dream ended with her lips on his. Sir Aedan Corvayne tasted salt and incense and the iron of his own blood at the same moment. The cathedral was full of white cloaks and silver light, 1,000 paladins kneeling, Lianna Swanveil rising from her knee with the blade Dawn in her hand. He had given her that blade a heartbeat before. She had kissed him a heartbeat before that. Now Dawn was inside him. The point had slipped between the third and fourth plate of his breastplate. It had angled up under his ribs. It had found his heart with the precision of 30 years of training. His training. He stared at her face. She was crying. Her hand on the hilt was steady. He understood in that final second that both things were true. The tears were real. The strike was perfect. He fell. The choir kept singing. He died on the marble with her kneeling over him, whispering something he could not hear. Then there was smoke. Then there was screaming. Then there was a body that was not his body. Aedan opened his eyes in the ninth circle. He was small. He was the size of a child of 8. His skin was the color of soot. He felt a tail twitch at the base of his spine. He felt 2 small horns curling above his temples. His hand was wrong. The fingers were too long and the nails were black. There was a rusted knife in that hand. Around him were thousands of others like him, imps, newborns of the ninth circle, boiling out of the cracks in the rock like roaches out of a wet log. They were screaming and biting each other and tearing scraps of something gray from a pile of refuse the size of a tower. The sky above was not a sky. It was a low red ceiling of churning ash. The air smelled like burned hair. Aedan did not scream. He sat up. He looked at his hand. He counted his fingers. He counted his breaths. He had done this once before, in a campaign tent after his first battle, when he was 19 and shaking. He had counted then, too. The counting steadied him now. He was dead. He was somewhere he should not be. Paladins did not come here. Paladins were lifted. He had been pulled down. That meant someone had pulled him. That meant his death was older than the moment of the blade. Lianna had cried because Lianna had loved him. Lianna had struck true because someone had taught her how to strike true for 30 years while he was teaching her to love him. He thought of her hand on the hilt. The grip was correct. The wrist was correct. The angle through the armor was correct. He had drilled her in that angle himself when she was 19. He had not realized then that he was teaching her how to kill him. Something heavy hit him in the side of the head. An imp 3 times his size had grabbed at his ankle and now was dragging him toward the refuse pile. The imp had a mouth full of teeth. The imp was laughing. Aedan did not feel fear. Aedan felt his hand close on the rusted knife. He let the imp pull him. He let the imp grin. When the mouth opened to bite his throat, he drove the knife up under the lower jaw and into the soft place behind the tongue. He knew where that place was. He had ended a demon with a thrust like that 20 years ago in the Pass of 7 Winds. The big imp went rigid. Aedan rolled out from under him. He took the dead imp's heavier knife. He took a strip of leather from the dead imp's belt and tied his tail up out of the way because the tail kept getting underfoot. Other imps were watching now. Aedan stood up to his small, full height. He thought a single line of the dawn prayer inside his head. The words burned along the inside of his teeth like swallowed coals. The pain made his eyes water. The pain also made the air around him refuse to harm him for a count of 3. He took those 3 seconds and used them. He killed 2 more imps before the prayer faded. He left their bodies where they fell. He walked away from the refuse pile, carrying both knives. He did not look back. Inside his mouth, the burn was already healing. Inside his head, the order's words were already forming the next line. He thought of Lianna's face. He fixed it inside himself. He carved it into the back of his ribs. He told himself her name out loud in his own skull. Lianna Swanveil. He repeated it 3 times. He had read once in an old paladin journal that demons forgot their mortal lives within a few months. He decided in that moment that he would not. The name would stay. The face would stay. The cathedral would stay. Not as wound, as compass. He walked through the smoke of the 9th circle. Somewhere far above him, on a continent he could not see, his killer was washing his blood off her hands. Somewhere even further above, someone who had arranged all of this was already moving the next piece. Aedan did not know who. Aedan did not need to know yet. He needed only to climb. 9 circles between him and the hand that had moved Lianna. He had drilled longer charges than that on a frozen battlefield. He kept walking. The knives were heavy. His new body was weak. His mind was the same mind that had cut the head from an archdemon of the 4th circle. He would be enough. He had to be enough. The 9th circle had no day and no night. It had shifts. 3 times in what felt like a long span, the red ceiling pulsed brighter and the work began. 6 times it dimmed and the imps slept where they fell. Aedan learned the rhythm in the first week. He stayed away from the refuse pile after the first kill. He found a crack in the rock the size of his small body and slept in it with both knives across his chest. He learned what the imps ate. They ate each other. They also ate the gray strips on the refuse pile, which were not food, but the burned residue of damned souls run through the lower furnaces. The strips made an imp grow. 3 strips made an imp grow a finger length. 10 strips made an imp grow a hand. Aedan did not fight for the strips at first. He watched. He watched which imps came back fed and which did not come back at all. He counted shifts. He counted the gates of the great furnace behind the pile. He counted the demon overseers, larger creatures with proper limbs and proper armor who walked the line and registered each kill on long scrolls of skin. The overseers did not care if an imp died. The overseers cared if a kill went unregistered. There was a clerk for every 20 corpses. Aedan watched a clerk for a full shift. The clerk had 4 arms and a long, pale face and held a quill of bone. The clerk wrote down every absorption in a column and stamped each line with a black seal. The clerk had not killed anyone in years. The clerk was bored. Aedan filed that detail away. He had spent half his life learning that the bored ones were the ones who could be used. After 3 weeks, he made his first move. He waited until a strong imp had just eaten 3 strips and was lying half-stunned in the new heaviness of his own growth. Aedan slid out of his crack. He cut the strong imp's throat from the side. He pressed his small mouth to the wound. He had seen the others do this. He drank. It was not blood. It was something like smoke and something like wine and something like the memory of being someone. The strong imp's life poured into him in a thin gray ribbon. Aedan felt his shoulders widen by half an inch. He felt his arms lengthen by a knuckle. He felt a stranger's thoughts brush past him. The strong imp had once been a man who beat his children. Aedan let that thought drift away. He did not need it. He needed only the growth. He killed 9 more imps that month. He killed them in their sleep. He killed them at the edge of the pile. He killed 1 in the queue for the clerk and let another imp take credit because Aedan did not want his name on the scroll yet. By the end of the first month, he was a head taller. His horns had thickened to the width of a man's thumb. His tail was longer, and he had learned to hold it still. He had also discovered something. The silent prayer worked, but only in pieces. The full dawn prayer in his head would have torn his small body apart from the inside. A single line was a coal in his teeth. A single word was a spark on his tongue. He learned to ration them. He learned to think the word lux before he killed. He learned to think the word sanctus before he slept. The word lux gave him a half-second where blades found him less easily. The word sanctus gave him 3 breaths of dreamless sleep without an imp trying to chew his face. He paid for both. His gums bled. His tongue had a permanent dark line down its center. He did not care. On the 40th day, he met Shkvark. Shkvark was the smallest imp Aedan had ever seen. Shkvark had been born without a tail, and the other imps had been trying to kill him for that for as long as he could remember. Shkvark hid under a flat stone near Aedan's crack. Shkvark watched Aedan kill and ate the scraps Aedan left behind. Aedan noticed him on the 3rd day of his hiding. Aedan did not kill him. Aedan put a strip of the gray refuse on the stone one evening and walked away. The next shift, the strip was gone. The shift after that, Shkvark followed Aedan at 6 paces. The shift after that, Shkvark was at 4 paces. Aedan stopped one shift and turned and asked the small imp in the broken speech of the 9th circle why he had no tail. Shkvark said that his mother had bitten it off because she thought it would make him lucky. It had not made him lucky. Aedan almost smiled. He had not smiled in this body. He held it back. He told Shkvark that they would work together. He told Shkvark the rules. The rules were 3. They did not kill what they did not have to kill. They did not eat what they had not earned. They watched the clerks. Shkvark did not understand the 3rd rule. Aedan said he would. Learn. They moved together after that. Shkvark was small, but Shkvark had been hiding all his life, and Shkvark knew every crack and every drain in the lower ash fields. Shkvark also knew which strong imps were rising and which strong imps were ready to fall. Aedan picked his next 8 kills from Shkvark's list. Each one fed him a little more. By the end of the 2nd month, Aedan was the size of a half-grown man. His skin was less ash and more iron. He was still small for a 9th circle demon. He was no longer prey. The clerks began to notice. One of them, a 4-armed creature named Vosik, called Aedan over one shift and asked his name. Aedan thought for a moment. He could not say Aedan. The syllables would have curled the clerk's parchment, and the clerk would have known something was wrong. He said Corvax. It was close enough to keep his own name alive inside his head, and strange enough to belong to this place. Vosik wrote Corvax in the column. Vosik stamped him with the black seal. Aedan was now an entry in the books of the 9th circle. He was no longer one of the unnamed thousands. That night, in his crack, with Shkvark curled small at his feet, Aedan thought the word Lux, and then he thought Lianna's name. He thought of her standing in the cathedral in the light of the windows. He thought of her hand on the hilt. He did not let himself imagine her now, alive on the surface. He was not ready to look in any mirror yet. He had no mirror. He had only the climb. He slept for the 3 breaths the word allowed him. He woke before the shift bell. He sharpened the heavier knife on the rock. Shkvark watched him with 2 pale eyes. Aedan told the small imp that they were going to climb. Shkvark asked how high. Aedan said all the way. 6 months in the 9th circle taught Aedan the 2nd law of the place. The 1st law had been the law of absorption. The 2nd law was the law of paper. Nothing in hell happened that was not written down. A demon could kill 1,000 of his rivals in open battle and gain nothing if a clerk did not stamp the column. A demon could murder 1 rival in a back tunnel and rise 3 ranks if the right clerk wrote it down with the right seal. The strong fought, the clever wrote. Aedan had been Grand Master of an order with 3,000 paladins and a treasury and a chain of command that stretched across 2 continents. He understood paper. He set Shkvark to watching the clerks. Shkvark counted which clerks took bribes and which clerks did not. Shkvark learned that Vosik, the four-armed one who had named Aedan Corvayne, would take a piece of preserved soul for any line in the book if the line was plausible. Aedan began to bring Vosik pieces. He killed weak demons and credited the kills to stronger ones who paid him a portion. He killed strong ones and credited the kills to himself. He did this for 2 months and gained 5 ranks, without any of the other Ninth Circle bosses noticing where the growth was coming from. By the end of the 5th month, he was a low servant of the Circle, no longer an imp, but a thing with proper arms and proper teeth, head and shoulders above the crawling masses. He had a small assigned pit at the edge of the ash fields. He had 3 subordinates. One of them was Shkvark, who was still small and still without a tail, and who was now listed in Vosik's book as Aedan's personal scribe. The other 2 were imps Aedan had spared because he believed they were not yet beyond saving. He was wrong about one. The wrong one was named Grask. Grask had survived by being useful to whoever was strongest in the moment. Grask had a face that smiled too easily for an imp. Aedan kept him close because he wanted to know what Grask would do. On the 6th month, Grask did it. Grask went to a rival overseer named Brakul and told Brakul that the new servant called Corvayne was a paladin in a demon's skin. He did not know how he knew. He had only watched Aedan move. He had seen Aedan kill a wounded imp once by ending the imp's suffering with a single clean cut. He had seen Aedan refuse to eat from a body that had not been earned. He had heard Aedan whisper words in his sleep that did not belong to any tongue of the Circle. Brakul listened. Brakul did not believe the word paladin. Brakul did believe that this Corvayne was strange, and that strange things were worth eating. Brakul came for Aedan with 12 of his demons during a shift change. Aedan saw them at the mouth of the pit because Shkvark had seen them first, and Shkvark had run faster than any imp without a tail had any right to run. Aedan had 2 breaths to prepare. He used the first to think the word lux. He used the second to draw both knives. The fight was short. Aedan had killed 12 demons at once before. He had done it in the Pass of 7 Winds, when he was 40 and his armor had been blessed and his sword had been dawn. He had no dawn here. He had 2 knives and a body that was still half new, and the silent words of an order that did not know he existed anymore. He killed 3 of Brakul's demons before they had closed the distance, throwing the heavier knife at the throat of the lead one, and tearing the second one's stomach open with his bare claws as the second one tried to grapple him. The third he killed by knowing exactly where the demonic heart sat in a Ninth Circle warrior, 2 hand widths below the collarbone and to the left, and driving his remaining knife into it without looking. The other 9 got their hands on him. They cut him 8 times. They broke his left arm above the elbow. They tore 1 horn off the side of his head. Aedan went down under them and thought the word sanctus, and then he thought lux a second time, fast, and the air around him refused to harm him for a count of 3. In those 3 seconds, he killed 4 more. Then the word died. Then they had him pinned. Then Brakul stepped forward and put a heavy, clawed foot on Aedan's chest and asked him if it was true. Aedan looked up at the overseer. He thought about denying it. He had been a man who did not lie. He had not been that man for 6 months now. He said in the broken speech of the Ninth Circle that he was Corvayne, a servant of this pit, and that Grask was a liar who wanted his place. Brakul looked over at Grask. Grask smiled the smile that smiled too easily. Brakul did not like that smile. Brakul had served in this circle for 200 years and had learned to distrust easy smiles. Brakul also looked at the 8 of his demons that Aedan had killed, and at the 3 that were dying, and at his own count of how many he had brought versus how many he had left. Brackle lifted his foot off Aedan's chest. Brackle said that the matter would be settled in the old way. The old way was a pit fight, Korvax against Grask. The survivor would keep the pit, and Brackle would take a fee of 1/4 of the survivor's future kills for the next year. Grask stopped smiling. Aedan stood up with his broken arm hanging. He looked at Grask. Grask was bigger than him by a head. Grask had not been wounded. Aedan said in his own head that he had taken a man's eye out with a broken arm before, in a tournament when he was 27 and his right shoulder had been dislocated. He said in his own head Lianna's name. He stepped into the ring of demons. The fight took less time than the talking before it. Grask lunged. Aedan let him lunge. Aedan turned his broken arm so the splintered bone end faced outward and let Grask's own weight drive Grask's eye onto it. Grask screamed. Aedan, with his good hand, took the knife from his belt and put it into the soft place behind Grask's lower jaw. The same place he had used on his first day in this body. The body remembered. Grask fell. Aedan drank. Grask's life went into him in a thicker ribbon than usual. The life of a betrayer is rich in this place, and Aedan felt something settle into him that had not been there before. A small, dark warmth in the chest. The taste of having paid back. He noted the warmth. He did not enjoy it. He filed it away as a thing to watch. Brackle nodded once. Brackle put a black seal on a scroll Vosik produced from somewhere and walked away with his surviving demons. Aedan went back to his pit. Shkvark was waiting in the rocks. Shkvark had been crying in the way imps cried, with no tears. Aedan let him press his small face against Aedan's good side for a moment. Then he sent Shkvark for bone splints and the bitter sap that demons used to seal their wounds. While he waited, he thought the word sanctus and held it in his head until his gums bled, because he was afraid that the small, dark warmth in his chest would grow if he did not pray. The broken arm healed crooked in 9 days. Aedan re-broke it himself against a stone and set it again with Shkvark holding the splint. The second setting healed straight. By the end of the 8th month, Aedan was the largest servant in his sector of the Ashfields, and the only one with a working scribe and a steady line in Vosik's book. He could have stayed. He had enough now to live well by the standards of the Ninth Circle, which meant he could sleep 4 shifts a week and only had to kill on the other 3. He did not stay. He had learned in the War for the Eastern Marches that an officer who stopped moving became a target painted on a hill. He moved. He picked his target. The target was a demon called the Pit Warden, a Ninth Circle lord who controlled the lift gates between the Ashfields and the Great Furnace network below. The Pit Warden was the highest demon Aedan had yet seen with his own eyes. The Pit Warden was 3 times Aedan's current size. The Pit Warden had 4 eyes and tusks the length of a man's forearm. The Pit Warden also had a problem. The problem was that the Pit Warden owed soul tax to the next circle above, the 8th, and the Pit Warden had been skimming for the last decade. Shkvark had found this out by watching 3 different clerks for 2 weeks. Shkvark had a gift for clerks. The clerks talked in front of small imps. Aedan took the information to Vosik and asked Vosik what such a thing was worth. Vosik said that such a thing was worth more than a clerk should accept, and that Vosik would not accept it. Aedan said that he was not selling the information. He was offering Vosik a chance to be the clerk of a new Pit Warden. Vosik's forearms went very still. After a long pause, Vosik asked who the new Pit Warden would be. Aedan said himself. Vosik laughed without sound for almost a full minute. Then Vosik stopped laughing because Vosik realized Aedan was not joking. Vosik asked Aedan how he would do it. Aedan told Vosik that he would do it by the rules of the 9th Circle, and that all Vosik had to do was be present at the lift gate on the 3rd shift of the 9th day from now with 3 blank scrolls and the black seal. Vosik agreed. Aedan spent the next 9 days preparing. He spoke to the demons under the pit warden's authority who had been skimmed in turn. He found that there were many. The pit warden had been generous with his skimming. Aedan promised each of them a share of the pit warden's holdings if they would simply not raise an alarm during the 9th third shift. None of them needed to fight. None of them needed to die. They only needed to look the other way for the length of a single quarrel. Most agreed. 2 refused. Aedan killed those 2 on the 7th and 8th days quietly in their pits and credited the kills through Vossak's book to a rival demon, who was very confused but did not complain. On the 9th third shift, Aedan walked to the lift gate alone. Shkvark watched from the rocks. Vossak waited near the gate with the scrolls. The pit warden was at his usual post, inspecting a cart of preserved souls bound for the 8th circle. The pit warden looked up and saw Aedan and laughed, and asked what a low servant was doing on the gate platform. Aedan said in the broken speech that he was here to invoke the right of challenge under the soul tax fraud clause. The pit warden stopped laughing. The soul tax fraud clause was a real thing. It existed because the higher circles wanted any demon who knew about a tax theft to report it. And the easiest way to incentivize the report was to let the reporter keep what they could take from the thief. Most demons never invoked it because most demons were not powerful enough to enforce it. Aedan was not powerful enough either. Aedan had instead removed every demon under the pit warden who might have intervened. The pit warden looked around. The pit warden saw his usual guards standing very still and looking very intently at the floor. The pit warden understood. The pit warden roared and charged. Aedan thought the word lux for the 3rd time in his career and added the word ferrum to it, a word he had used only once before when he was 44 and dying of poison on a battlefield and needed 2 breaths of unbreakable skin to crawl to his canteen. The 2 words together took the skin off the inside of his throat. He could not have spoken for a week afterwards if anyone had cared. They did not care. The pit warden's tusks struck Aedan in the chest and slid off as if Aedan were made of polished granite. Aedan caught one of the tusks in his hand and twisted. The tusk snapped at the root. The pit warden screamed. Aedan drove the broken tusk into the pit warden's nearest eye and out the back of the skull. The pit warden fell. The skin on Aedan's chest cracked open in the same instant the words faded, and blood the color of old wine poured down his front. He did not bleed out. He had 2 breaths of grace, and he used them to put his mouth to the pit warden's neck and drink. The pit warden's life flooded into him in a torrent. Aedan grew. He grew where he stood, the way a fire grows when oil is poured on it. His shoulders widened, his ribs lengthened, his horns curved. By the time he stood up from the corpse, he was nearly the pit warden's own size. His skin had darkened from iron to coal. His eyes had taken on a new color underneath the demonic black, a thin ring of silver at the edge of each iris that had not been there before. Vossak stamped a scroll. Vossak stamped another. Vossak wrote in his book the word Korvax, and beside it the word pit warden in the column of titles. Aedan was now a lord of the 9th circle. He stood on the gate platform and looked up through the haze toward the dim arches that led to the 8th. He thought of Lianna for a moment. She would be in the cathedral now, on the surface, washing her face after some ceremony. He did not know what she did in the days. He did not look in any mirror yet. He told himself he would look only when he had something worth showing her. Shkvark crept out of the rocks and stared at Aedan with both pale eyes wide. Aedan said in his cracked voice that they were leaving the ash fields. Shkvark asked when. Aedan said tomorrow. Then Aedan walked into the pit warden's old quarters, which were now his own, and sat down on the pit warden's stone chair and bled quietly onto the floor, while Vasuk closed the books for the shift. The lift gates of the 9th circle opened upward into the 8th on the first shift after the pit warden's death. Aedan rode in the cart of preserved souls with Shkvark crouched beside him and a copy of Vasuk's stamped scroll tucked into his belt. The cart climbed for what felt like a day. The walls of the shaft were old, older than anything in the ash fields, and they were carved with rows of faces that wept dry tears. Aedan recognized one of the faces. It was a king he had executed when he was 32. The king's face wept anyway. Aedan looked away. The 8th circle was called the Salt Plain of Weeping. It was a vast white desert under the same red ceiling, but the desert was not sand. It was the dried tears of damned souls, harvested over centuries and laid out in dunes for the mining demons to work. The 8th circle's economy ran on tears. Tears were rendered into salt. Salt was rendered into the binding agent that held demonic contracts together. Without the salt of the 8th circle, no contract in hell would hold. Aedan stepped off the cart into white dust that stung his new, larger feet. The light was different here, paler and crueler. He could see further. He saw the mining pits in the distance, long terraced cuts in the salt, and the work crews crawling along them like ants. Each crew was 1,000 demons of the lower kind, and each 1,000 was overseen by 10 warriors of the 8th circle proper, demons 2 heads taller than Aedan and armored in plates of cured tear salt. A reception committee of 3 such warriors met him at the platform. They had been told by their own clerk, who had been told by Vasuk through the inter-circle channels, that a new lord had risen in the 9th and was coming up to register. They were not happy about it. They were not unhappy either. Aedan was a 9th circle lord, which in the eyes of an 8th circle warrior was barely a step above an imp. He was tolerated because the paperwork said he must be tolerated. He was given quarters on the lowest tier of the mining settlement near the soul cart loading yard. He was given a token allowance of salt rations. He was registered in the 8th circle's books under the same name, Corvax, and given a rank designator that meant, in their tongue, something like provisional foreign lord. Aedan accepted all of it. He did not press for more. He went to his quarters and put Shkvark in charge of finding out 3 things. The first was who in the mining settlement was unhappy. The second was who in the mining settlement was strong. The third was where the 2 lists overlapped. Shkvark scuttled off. Aedan sat alone in the salt-walled room and finally allowed himself to look at his own reflection. There was a basin of dark water in the corner, used for washing salt out of demonic wounds, and the water was still enough to show him his face. He bent over it. The face that looked back was not his old face. It was a heavy, demonic face, with thick brows and short, curved horns, and a jaw that could break a man's wrist if it closed on him. The skin was coal black. The mouth was wider than a human mouth. The eyes were demon black at the center, but around the pupils, in a thin, clear ring, the silver of his old paladin gaze still burned. It was the only thing left of Sir Aedan Corvayne. He looked at the silver for a long moment. He whispered Lianna's name in his head 3 times. He sat back from the basin. He had been 7 months in this body. He had risen from imp to imp lord. He had killed perhaps 80 demons of varying size. He had a follower. He had a clerk. He had a foothold in the 2nd circle of his climb. He had 8 more circles to cross before he reached the one who had moved Lianna's hand. The math was not kind. At his current rate of growth, he would need 100 years to reach the 1st circle, and that was if nothing went wrong. Something would go wrong. Something always went wrong. He thought of Lianna again. He thought of her hand on the hilt of dawn. He thought of how steady the hand had been. Whoever had trained her to be that steady was patient. Whoever had arranged Aedan's death in such a way that his soul fell here, not above, was older than patient. Aedan could afford to be older still. He stood up from the basin. He decided the salt plane would not take him 100 years. He decided it would take him less than 1. By the time Shkvark came back with the lists, Aedan already had the outline of a plan. Shkvark reported. The strongest demon in the mining settlement was Master Coral, an overseer of overseers, who controlled all 12 mining pits and reported directly to the Archdemon of the 8th Circle. The unhappiest demons in the mining settlement were the salt grinders, the low-caste workers who actually processed the tears into binding salt, and who had not had their rations raised in 40 years, while Master Coral had built 3 new pleasure halls for himself in the same period. There were 40,000 salt grinders. There was 1 Master Coral. Aedan looked at Shkvark. Shkvark looked at Aedan. Aedan said in his still raw voice that he had led a campaign with worse numbers. He had once held a mountain pass with 70 paladins against 6,000 raiders. He had won that campaign by understanding that an army was not a number, but a structure, and a structure had joints, and joints could be broken. He told Shkvark to go among the salt grinders and find which of them had once been smiths and which had once been soldiers in their mortal lives. The 8th Circle was full of damned souls who had been mortal craftsmen, and craftsmen remembered their hands. Even in demonic bodies, hands remembered. Shkvark went. Aedan stayed in the salt-walled room and did something he had not done since the cathedral. He knelt. The floor cut his knees through the demonic hide. He did not speak. He pressed his clawed hands together in the old paladin form. He thought, not spoke, but thought, the full dawn prayer from start to end. The pain ran through him in a slow current. By the end of it, his back was wet with his own dark blood, and his vision was full of small white sparks. But when he stood up, he was steady. He was Aedan again, inside the body of Corvax. He looked at the basin one more time. He did not look at his reflection. He looked through it. He thought of Lianna in the cathedral on the day he had handed her dawn. He told her, silently, that he was on the 2nd Circle now, that he was coming, that he was slow, but that he was coming. He did not yet know that on the surface, far above his head, Lianna Swanveil had just stood in the same cathedral and put her hand on a stranger's shoulder, and that the stranger wore a plain gray cloak and had no face that Aedan would have been able to see even with a mirror of worlds, and that the stranger had leaned in and whispered something in her ear that had made her start to cry again for the first time in 7 months. Aedan, far below, picked up his knives. He sharpened them on the salt wall. He waited for Shkvark to return. Shkvark came back on the 3rd shift with the names of 19 former smiths and 47 former soldiers among the salt grinders. He had also brought one of them in person. The grinder was a thick-shouldered demon of the lowest 8th Circle caste, with a flat, broken face and hands that were too large for his arms. His name in this life was Brun. His name in his mortal life had been Brun also, because he had been a blacksmith in a northern village 400 years ago, and the demon who had absorbed him on arrival had been lazy with the renaming. Aedan looked at Brun, and Brun looked at Aedan, and Aedan saw in Brun's eyes the same dull fire he had once seen in the eyes of conscripts on the 2nd day of a long march. Aedan asked him in the broken speech how long he had ground salt. Brun said 400 years. Aedan asked him how many of his fellows would rise if a lord told them to rise. Brun thought about this for a long time. Brun said that none of them would rise for a lord. Aedan asked who they would rise for. Brun said that they would rise for a man who remembered being a man. Aedan was quiet for a count of 10. Then he sent Shkvark out of the room. He looked at Brun. He did something he had promised himself he would not do for at least another year. He let the silver in his eyes show. He let it widen, the way a paladin opened his gaze before a blessing, and he let Brune see it. Brune's flat, broken face did not change, but the dull fire in his eyes went hot for a moment, and then went cold again, and Brune lowered his head. And Brune said in the old tongue of his mortal village, not the broken speech of the Eighth Circle, that he would carry a message. Aedan answered him in the same old tongue. He had learned that tongue when he was 26 on his first campaign in the north. He had not spoken it in 20 years above and 7 months below. The words came back slow and rusty. Brune smiled at the rust. Aedan told him the plan. The plan was not complicated. The salt grinders would slow the work for 9 shifts. Not stop, slow. Output would drop by a fifth. Master Coral would have to explain the drop to the Archdemon of the Eighth Circle, who was a creature named Lord Ulthon, a demon of 700 years, whose favorite hobby was punishing subordinates who failed to meet quotas. On the 10th shift, when Master Coral was on his way to the audience hall to make his explanations, Aedan would intercept him. There would be no witnesses. There would be a corpse, an absorption, and a new master of mining pits, who would by the same morning bring the output back up to its previous level, and credit the recovery to himself. The Archdemon of the Eighth Circle would be displeased only with Coral, who would be conveniently dead. The plan had 3 weak points. The first was that the salt grinders had to actually slow without being caught. The second was that Master Coral had to actually take the route Aedan expected. The third was that Aedan had to actually be able to kill a demon 2 ranks above him. Brune handled the first. The slowing began on the next shift and was invisible at first. A grinder would let a stone slip from his hand. A cart would lose a wheel. A binding vat would crack across the bottom and need an hour to seal. None of it was sabotage that any overseer could point to. All of it was the kind of slow that any old worker in any old industry could produce, if he stopped caring exactly the right amount. By the 4th shift, the output was down a 10th. By the 7th, it was down a 5th. By the 9th, Master Coral was screaming at his overseers in the open yard, and the overseers were screaming at the grinders, and the grinders were apologizing with the precise tone of men who had been apologizing for 400 years. Aedan handled the second. He paid a small bribe to the clerk who scheduled the audiences with the Archdemon, and arranged for Master Coral's slot to be the last of the 10th shift, which meant Master Coral would walk the long corridor from the mining settlement to the audience hall alone. Because the last slot of the day was always taken when one's escort had already gone off duty. The clerk took the bribe because the clerk also did not like Master Coral. Master Coral had built his pleasure halls partly with funds that should have gone to the clerks. The third point, Aedan handled himself. He spent the 9 days in his salt-walled room. He did not eat. He thought one line of the dawn prayer at every shift bell. He let the burn build in his throat and let it sit there like a banked coal. He did not pray for power. He prayed for steadiness. He had killed bigger things than Master Coral in his life above. He needed his hands to remember and his new body to obey. On the 10th shift, Aedan was in the corridor an hour before Master Coral was due to walk it. He had hidden himself in a salt alcove that smelled of old crying. He waited the way he had once waited for an ambush on the road to the Pass of 7 Winds, motionless, breathing slow, counting nothing. Master Coral came. The master of mining pits was a creature nearly the size of the old pit warden, but built differently, narrower at the shoulders and longer in the arm, with a beak instead of tusks. His armor was tear salt cured to the hardness of steel. He walked with the heavy step of a demon who was angry and trying to look unconcerned. Aedan let him pass the alcove by 3 steps. Then Aedan stepped out behind him and thought the word lux and the word ferrum and the word silence at the same time. The 3 words together took the inside of his throat off entirely. He would not be able to make a sound for a month. He did not need to. He needed only to move. Master Coral heard nothing. Aedan crossed the 3 steps in one bound and drove his heavier knife up under the salt armor at the base of the spine, where he had observed during 4 days of watching that Master Coral scratched himself in private. The knife went into the hilt. Master Coral arched backward, his beak opened. No sound came out, because Aedan's 3rd word had cost a price, but had also paid for the kill. And the corridor was held in a sphere of silence the width of a small room. Aedan drove the 2nd knife into the base of the skull from below. Master Coral fell forward. Aedan caught him before he hit the floor, because a falling body made noise even inside silence if it was heavy enough to vibrate the stone. He lowered the corpse gently. He put his mouth to the wound at the base of the skull and drank. Master Coral's life poured into him in a hot rush, thicker than the pit warden's, sour with 2 centuries of salt and pleasure and small cruelties. Aedan grew again. His shoulders broadened by a hand width. His chest deepened. The horns on his head curved further. His skin went from coal to a dark iron sheen, with veins of dull red running under it. The silver in his eyes brightened. When he stood up from the corpse, he was a head taller than he had been at dawn. He was no longer a 9th Circle Lord visiting the 8th. He was an 8th Circle Master, in body, if not yet in paper. He dragged the corpse into the alcove. He left the 2nd knife in the skull because the knife had absorbed enough of the bone to be useless for anything else, and he did not want to leave a clean blade for any investigator. He walked the rest of the corridor in the dying sphere of silence. He arrived at the audience hall. He told the clerk at the door, by writing on a scrap of cured skin because his throat was a ruin, that he was Corvax of the 9th, and that he had been the witness of Master Coral's death by misadventure on the corridor, and that he wished to invoke the right of inheritance under the Provisional Foreign Lord Clause. The clerk read the scrap of skin. The clerk looked at the silver in Aedan's eyes. The clerk wrote 3 lines in a book and stamped them with a black seal. By the end of the 10th shift, Aedan was the new master of the 12 mining pits. The first thing Aedan did as master of the 12 mining pits was raise the rations of the salt grinders by 1/10. He did it on paper through Vosik, who had been promoted up to the 8th Circle on Aedan's recommendation, and now sat in an office 2 corridors away from Aedan's own quarters. The raise was invisible to anyone above the rank of overseer because Aedan also cut the perfume allowance of the pleasure halls by an equal amount. Pleasure hall stewards complained. Pleasure hall stewards did not have 40,000 bodies behind them. The grinders did. The grinders did not cheer when they heard about the raise, because grinders did not cheer. But on the 2nd shift after the change, the output went up by 1/15 without any visible change in effort, and Aedan understood that he had bought 400 years of resentment with 1/10 of perfume. He filed the lesson. He had known it above as a young captain. Soldiers worked harder for an officer who fed them than for an officer who flogged them. It was not different here. It was only slower. Aedan stayed as master of the pits for 9 months. He used the time to study the upward channels of the 8th Circle, the paths of paperwork and patronage and personal grudge that connected a mining settlement to the higher offices of Lord Ulfon. He learned that Lord Ulfon was not actually the Archdemon of the 8th Circle. Lord Ulfon was the regent. The true Archdemon of the 8th had not been seen in his own court for 300 years. He had withdrawn into the deep salt and was rumored to be either mad or dead, and Lord Ulfon ruled in his place under the fiction of constant deputization. Aedan understood at once that this fiction was the joint of the 8th Circle, the place where the structure could be broken if a smaller force was applied at the right angle. He did not break it yet. He marked it. He kept the pits running. He sent the proper tributes upward in the proper amounts on the proper shifts. He took no audiences with Lord Ulthon that he could refuse. He let himself be invisible at the rank of Master of Mining, which was a rank too low to be interesting and too high to be eaten by an envious rival without paperwork. In the 9th month, 2 things happened that changed his plan. The first was a visitor. The visitor came down the lift gates from the 7th circle without paperwork. The visitor was a tall, slim demoness with skin the color of pale wine and hair like dark smoke, and she walked through the salt corridors as if salt belonged to her. She was attended by 4 guards of the 7th circle, demons of a refined kind that Aedan had never seen at the lower levels, all of them with the same dark smoke hair. They came to Aedan's quarters in the middle of the 8th shift. The demoness asked the salt warden at his door, in a voice that was lower than her body suggested, to please tell Master Corvax that an emissary of the court of Manhwa had come to take tea with him. Aedan understood 3 things in the space of half a breath. The first was that demonesses of the 7th circle did not drink tea. The second was that Manhwa was the name of the archdemoness of the 7th circle, the Lady of Want, whose court was the most politically dangerous court in all the lower circles. The third was that an emissary from such a court did not visit a master of mining pits in the 8th circle by accident. He let her in. He bowed at the angle a 9th circle lord would bow to a 7th circle envoy, which was almost to the floor. The demoness laughed without sound, the same soundless laugh he had once seen Vosik make. She told him to stop bowing, that she was not here on protocol. She told him she had been sent to deliver a message. She said the message was a question. The question was whether Master Corvax of the 9th had any interest in coming to the court of Manhwa when he eventually rose, as everyone in the 7th and 8th circles now expected him to rise, to the level where such an invitation would not be a joke. Aedan said nothing for a long moment. He could not speak, technically, because his throat was still healing from the triple prayer. But even if his throat had been whole, he would not have spoken at once. He wrote on a scrap of skin that he was honored. He wrote that he was a simple master and would not presume to anticipate his own rise. He wrote that he would remember the question. The demoness read the scrap of skin and laughed her soundless laugh again. She told him that the Lady Manhwa had specifically asked her to convey that she had been watching him for some time. She told him that the lady had noticed his rate of growth. She told him that the lady had also noticed a quality in his absorptions, a residue of something the lady could not name, which the lady found interesting. The demoness paused. She added, in a voice still lower than before, that the Lady Manhwa did not normally find anything interesting that did not concern her own pleasure or her own position, and that the fact she had taken the trouble to send an emissary was itself a fact worth carrying upward in Master Corvax's own calculations. Aedan wrote on the scrap that he understood. The demoness inclined her head. She left. Her 4 guards followed her without a sound. The salt corridors did not return to their usual smell of crying for an hour afterwards. The second thing happened on the same shift. Shkvark came running from the lower yards with his small face the color of ash, even by the standards of an imp. He had been in the lower yards because Aedan had set him to watching a specific corridor, the long corridor where Master Coral had died, because Aedan had heard that an inspector from the 7th circle was due to walk it on the 8th shift, and Aedan had wanted to know what the inspector would do. The inspector had walked the corridor. The inspector had paused in the alcove where Master Coral's body had been dragged. The inspector had bent down and run a clawed finger along the salt floor where Aedan had stood while drinking, and the inspector had then placed that finger in his mouth. And the inspector had then closed his eyes for a count of 30, and the inspector had then walked on without a word. Shkvark had not been able to see the inspector's face. Shkvark had been able to see the cloak. The cloak was plain gray. It had no insignia. It had no circle marking. Aedan went very still. He had been thinking of gray cloaks for 7 months. He had thought of them every time he allowed himself to think of the surface, and of Lianna, and of the visitor that he could not yet see in any mirror because he did not yet have access to a mirror of worlds. Gray cloaks meant nothing. Gray was a color. There were probably 10,000 demons in the 8th circle alone who owned a gray cloak. He told himself this. He did not believe himself. He wrote on the scrap of skin for Shkvark to follow the inspector at the safest distance Shkvark could manage, and to learn anything he could about who the inspector reported to and where the inspector slept. Shkvark left at once. Aedan sat in his quarters and stared at the basin of dark water in the corner, and did not look into it. He did not pray. He did not move. He sat for an entire shift in silence. When the next shift bell rang, he stood up. He had decided 2 things during the silence. The first was that he would accept the invitation of Manhwa when it came in proper form, because the 7th circle would let him climb 3 circles in 1 move if he played the court well. The second was that he would not tell Manhwa or her emissary or any demon at all about the inspector in the gray cloak. The inspector belonged to him. The inspector was his thread upward. The proper invitation from the court of Manhwa arrived on Aedan's 3rd year mark in hell. It came on a roll of cured skin sealed with red wax and carried by 2 demonesses of the same dark smoke kind. It was addressed to Lord Corvax of the 8th, which was a title he had earned in the 14 months since the first emissary's visit, by climbing from Master of the 12 mining pits to Warden of the Lower Salt Provinces, and then to the Regent's own Council of 9, the body that advised Lord Ulthon on matters of circle policy. He had done all of it without killing Lord Ulthon, which had been the trickier choice, because killing Lord Ulthon would have brought the absent Archdemon of the 8th down from the deep salt, and Aedan was not yet ready for an Archdemon. He had instead made himself useful to Lord Ulthon by solving small administrative problems, the way a clever lieutenant made himself useful to a tired old colonel. Lord Ulthon had begun to depend on him by the 8th month, and to fear losing him by the 12th. By the 14th month, Aedan was the regent's most trusted advisor, which made him, in practical terms, the 2nd highest demon of the 8th circle. The invitation from Manhwa acknowledged this rank. It also went around it. The invitation invited Lord Corvax to spend a season at the court of the 7th as a personal guest of the Archdemoness, in order to study what the letter called the higher arts of governance. Aedan understood that the higher arts of governance meant the politics of the upper circles. He also understood that the season meant indefinite. He accepted the same shift. He left the 8th circle in Lord Ulthon's care with the Council of 9 and Vosuk's clerical network behind him, both of which now belonged to him in practice. He took Shkvark with him. He left Brune the blacksmith, now elevated to overseer of the salt grinders, with instructions to keep the rations stable and the output steady, and to send any news of the gray-cloaked inspector through Vosuk if such news appeared. The inspector had not appeared again in 14 months. Shkvark had tracked him to a quarters in the upper 8th, watched the quarters for 8 shifts, and found that the quarters were empty. The inspector had checked out, in the clerical sense, 3 shifts after his visit to the corridor, and the registry of where he had gone next had been redacted with a level of clerical seal that even Vosuk could not break. Aedan had filed the thread and let it lie. The lift gates of the 7th circle were nothing like the lift gates of the 8th. The 7th did not look like hell at first sight. It looked like a country. The ceiling above was still red, but it was higher, almost the height of a true sky, and it was wreathed in slow clouds of dark vapor that played the part of weather. The land was rolling and dark, with low hills and slow rivers of black water and orchards of trees whose fruit was shaped like fists, and which Aedan recognized, after the first hour, as the orchards of want, where each fruit contained a single thing that a damned soul had craved most in life and would now crave forever without being able to eat. The court of Manhwa sat in the middle of this country, in a palace that was not stone, but glass, dark glass, blown into the shape of a flower the size of a small city, with each petal an audience hall, and each anther a tower of administration. Aedan and Shkvark were received in the central hall. Aedan had grown again on the way up the lift. The transit between circles carried with it a small absorption of the ambient power of the new circle, and by the time he stepped out onto the dark glass floor of Manhwa's hall, he was the size of a tall human, and his skin had darkened from iron to ash, and his horns had grown to the length of a man's hand. The silver in his eyes had brightened to the point that the demons of the seventh whispered about it as he walked. He bowed to Manhwa at the angle of a seventh circle guest bowing to his hostess. He had memorized the angle from a book that Vasek had found him. Manhwa sat on a chair of dark glass at the far end of the hall. She was the most beautiful thing Aedan had seen in 3 years, and the most dangerous. Her skin was pale wine, like her emissaries, and her hair was longer, falling to her waist in dark smoke, and her eyes were the color of old amber. She wore a robe of woven hunger. She did not stand. She smiled. She said in a voice that carried across the entire hall, though it sounded as if she had spoken only to him, that Lord Corvax of the Eighth was welcome in her court, and that she had ordered the orchards to bear a fruit of his own want in his honor, which would be ready for him at his pleasure. Aedan thanked her. He did not ask what the fruit would contain. He did not need to. He knew what it would contain. He had known for 3 years that if anyone offered him a single want, the fruit would be shaped like a 30-year-old woman with brown hair and gray eyes, weeping while her hand stayed steady on a hilt. He did not look toward the orchards. Manhwa watched him not look. Her smile changed by a fraction. He could not tell if she was amused or impressed. She gestured him forward. She told him, in the more private voice she used at close range, that they would speak honestly later, when the formalities had been worn down. For now, she would only ask him one question. Aedan said that he was at her service. Manhwa asked him whether he knew who in hell would benefit most from the death of Veliar, Archdemon of the Ninth Circle, Lord of Betrayal. Aedan did not answer at once. He understood that the answer she wanted was an answer that compromised him. He understood that any answer he gave would be remembered. He also understood that no answer would be remembered worse. He answered honestly. He said that he did not know who would benefit most because he had not yet been in hell long enough to know all the players, but he could guess who would benefit least, which was Veliar himself. And from that, he could infer that any conversation about Veliar's death was a conversation that Veliar's enemies were eager to have, and Veliar's friends were eager to record. He added, in the same private voice, that he did not yet know whether his lady was an enemy or a friend of Veliar, and until he knew, he would not commit himself to a guess in either direction. Manhwa looked at him for a long count. Then she laughed, this time aloud, and the laugh shook the dark glass of the hall and made 3 of her own courtiers wince. She told him he was welcome at her court for as long as he wished. She told him he would be given quarters in the South Tower, which were the quarters of honored guests who were also being watched. She told him that they would speak again in a month, when he had seen enough of the seventh to have opinions worth hearing. She dismissed him with a wave. Aedan walked out of the hall with Shkvark beside him. He had survived his first audience with an archdemoness. He had given her no useful answer and 3 useless ones, which was the correct ratio for a first audience. He had also confirmed something he had only suspected. There was a faction in the Seventh Circle that wanted Veliar dead. He filed that with the gray-cloaked inspector and the cathedral and the steady hand on the hilt. The threads were beginning to braid. The south tower of the court of Manhwa was a long spiral of dark glass that climbed 7 stories into the false sky of the Seventh Circle. Aedan's quarters were on the 5th floor, 3 rooms of black glass that contained a bed of woven shadow, a basin of clear water for washing, a writing desk of polished bone, and a single mirror set into the eastern wall. The mirror was not a mirror of worlds. It was an ordinary mirror in which Aedan could see only himself. He understood from the first shift that the basin and the mirror were both reporting instruments. Demons of the seventh circle were clever. The basin's water would record any prayer Aedan was foolish enough to whisper into it. The mirror's frame would record any expression Aedan was foolish enough to wear when he thought no one was watching. He washed in the basin without prayer. He looked into the mirror without expression. He spent the first month learning the court. The court of Manhwa had 300 named courtiers, divided into 7 houses, each house headed by a duke or duchess of the 7th circle. Each house was a faction. Each faction wanted a slightly different thing. The House of Petals wanted increased trade with the 8th circle. The House of Glass wanted reduced taxes upward to the 6th. The House of Thorns wanted open war with the 9th circle. The House of Embers wanted alliance with the 6th against the 5th. The House of Mirrors wanted nothing visible and was therefore the most dangerous. The House of Cinders wanted the death of Velyar in particular. The House of Names wanted the death of the Boglight. Aedan had not known until his 4th week that the last house existed at all. He learned of it when one of its members approached him in the orchards. The member was a tall, slim courtier with red eyes and no hair, and a robe of unwoven hunger, the formal counterpart to Manhwa's woven hunger. The courtier introduced himself as Duke Arak of the House of Names. He asked Aedan, without preamble, whether Aedan knew the name of the god who had killed him. Aedan, by this point in his rise, was no longer easily surprised. He had been a paladin for 30 years, and a demon for 3. He had been asked many questions designed to compromise him. This one was designed differently. This one assumed that he already knew the answer, and was checking to see if he would admit it. He answered, carefully, that he did not know the name of the god who had killed him, but that he had begun to suspect that a god was involved, and that he would be grateful for any thread that led him closer to such a name. The Duke smiled. The Duke said that the House of Names collected the true names of the gods of light and the gods of dark, and that any demon who had been killed by a god was eligible for membership in the house, and that Aedan would be considered an honored prospect should he wish to join. Aedan asked what the cost of membership was. The Duke said that the cost of membership was a small piece of the candidate's own soul, which would be held in the house's vault as collateral against betrayal, and that this piece would be returned upon the candidate's death or full membership confirmation, whichever came first. Aedan said he would think on it. The Duke bowed and left. Aedan walked the orchards for an hour. He did not look at the fruit that bore the shape of Lianna's face. He thought instead about the offer. A demon could survive without a small piece of his soul. Demons routinely traded slivers for favors. The risk of the trade was not material death, but a slow corrosion of self, an inch of forgetting per year, which most demons did not mind because most demons had nothing worth remembering. Aedan had something worth remembering. He had Lianna's name, and Lianna's face, and Lianna's hand on the hilt of dawn. He had decided in the 9th circle that he would not let any of these go. He decided in the orchards that he would not join the House of Names. He decided also that he would let the Duke believe he was considering it, because a Duke who believed Aedan was a prospect would tell Aedan things a Duke who knew Aedan was a refusal would not. He went back to his quarters. He wrote on a scrap of skin a note to himself, which he then burned, in which he listed every thread he now held. The threads were these. There was a faction in the 7th that wanted Velyar dead. There was a house in the 7th that wanted the gods of light dead. There had been a gray-cloaked inspector in the 8th who had tasted the salt of Master Coral's death and known what he was tasting. There had been a hand on the hilt of dawn in a cathedral on the surface that had been trained for 30 years to steadiness by someone who had also arranged that Aedan's soul fall here rather than rise. There were 12 paladins, according to a rumor he had not yet confirmed, who had walked the circles before him. There was something in his absorptions that Merva had noticed and could not name. The threads led to a single weaving. He could not yet see the weaver. He could see the shape of the loom. In the second month, Merva called him to her again. This time, the audience was private, in a small glass chamber at the heart of the Petal Palace, with no courtiers and no guards present. Only Merva on her dark glass chair and Aedan on a stool of bone. She did not smile this time. She told him that she had finally identified the residue in his absorptions. She told him that the residue was prayer. She told him that a demon who carried prayer in his absorptions was either a paladin who had fallen, or a demon who had absorbed a paladin, or a fiction invented by Velyar to destabilize her court. She told him she did not believe the third. She asked him which of the first two he was. Aedan looked at her for a long count. He had 3 options. He could lie, he could tell a partial truth, he could tell the full truth. The full truth would put him in her hands, and possibly in her bed, and possibly in her vault. The lie would be detected within a week, because Merva was older than the lie. The partial truth was the only path that left him both useful to her and dangerous to her. He told her the partial truth. He said that he had been a paladin in his mortal life, of an order on the surface, that he had been killed by the hand of his own beloved student, that he had woken in the 9th circle without explanation, and that he had been climbing since. He did not name the order. He did not name Lianna. He did not name the suspicion of a god. He let her infer all 3, and watched which ones she inferred. Merva inferred all 3. She did not say so. She only nodded once. She told him that she had suspected as much from the first emissary's report. She told him that she would not turn him over to anyone because a fallen paladin in her court was the rarest weapon she could imagine, and weapons were not given away. She told him that she would also not press him to swear to her because a fallen paladin who swore under pressure was a weapon that broke at the first blow. She offered him instead a long arrangement. He would remain her guest. He would advise her on the politics of the lower circles, which he now knew better than her own courtiers. He would in turn be allowed access to a mirror of worlds in her private wing, which he could use once per month for the length of a single shift, to look upon the surface and upon any person there he wished to see. Aedan went very still. He had not asked. He had not even hinted. She had read him entirely through what he had not said. He understood in that moment that Merva was the most dangerous demon he had yet met, and that he was going to accept her offer, and that he was going to have to pay her price even if she had not yet named it. He bowed his head. He told her he accepted. She smiled the smile of a hostess whose guest had finally agreed to eat. She told him the mirror would be made available to him on the next first shift of the next month. She told him he should think carefully about who he wished to see first. Aedan went back to his quarters in the South Tower. He did not need to think. He had known for 3 years who he would see first. The first shift of the next month came slow. Aedan spent the wait studying the court and pretending not to count the shifts. He did count them. He counted them the way a young paladin counted the hours to the end of a watch. On the morning of the appointed shift, a glass attendant came to his quarters and led him through a corridor of the Petal Palace he had not seen before. A corridor whose walls were not dark glass, but clear glass, and through which Aedan could see, on the other side, an empty garden of black water lilies that did not move in any wind. The corridor opened into a circular chamber. The chamber had no furniture except a single tall mirror standing in the center on a base of bone. The mirror was as tall as Aedan and twice as wide, and its surface was not silver, but a slow gray, like water settled in a stone basin at dusk. The attendant left him. The door of clear glass closed behind her. Aedan walked to the mirror. He stood in front of it. The surface did not show him his reflection. The surface waited. Merva had told him the method. The method was simple. Hold the face of the person in mind. Hold the place. Speak no names. Speak no words. Wait. He held Lianna's face. He held the cathedral. He waited. The gray surface of the mirror clouded and then cleared. He saw the cathedral. It was older than he remembered. There were small repairs in the stained glass that had not been there in his time, and a banner he did not recognize hung from the high beam above the altar. The banner bore the sigil of the Order of the Silver Dawn, but with an addition he had never seen, a small black star beside the original sun. He filed this. He did not have time to study it. The mirror moved his sight, the way a hawk moved its sight, and he was looking down the nave toward the altar, and there she was. Lianna Swanveil stood at the altar in the white cloak of the Grand Master. She wore the chain of office he had worn for 15 years. She held the sword Dawn at her hip. She was older. 3 years was not enough to age a paladin of her rank by much, but he could see it anyway, in the way she stood, in the slight set of her shoulders. She had been carrying weight. She was alone in the cathedral, except for 2 attendants who waited at a respectful distance near the side door. She was speaking to no one. She was simply standing at the altar, with her hand resting on the pommel of Dawn, looking up at the high window above the altar, the same window through which the light had fallen on her 30 years before, when she had first been knighted by Aedan's own hand. Aedan stood in the chamber of the mirror and looked at her and did not move. He had not seen her face in 3 years. He had carved it into the back of his ribs every shift of every day since he had arrived. He had been certain that he remembered it. He had not remembered it correctly. The real face had small lines around the eyes that he had not put into his memory. The real face had a tightness at the corner of the mouth that he had not put into his memory. The real face was both more tired and more beautiful than the face he had carried. He watched her stand at the altar for what felt like an hour. The mirror showed him only her, no sound, no smell, no sense of the air she stood in. He watched her hand on the pommel. The hand was steady. The hand was the same hand. He understood without surprise that he was crying. He had not cried in this body before. The tears were dark, and they smoked when they hit the floor of the chamber. He did not wipe them. He let them fall. He had paid a great deal of price for this hour. He would not waste it on dignity. After a long time, Lianna moved. She lifted her hand from the pommel of Dawn. She walked from the altar to a side chapel that he remembered, the Chapel of the Empty Helm, where the order kept the helmets of paladins who had died in service. She walked to a particular helmet. The helmet was his. It sat on a small black pedestal. She knelt in front of it. She did not pray. She put her forehead against the helmet. She stayed there. Aedan watched her stay there. After a measure he could not count, he saw her shoulders begin to shake. She was weeping into his helmet. She wept without sound. She wept the way she had wept in the moment of the strike, with tears that were entirely real, running down a face that did not contort. Aedan put his clawed hand against the surface of the mirror. The surface did not yield. He had known it would not yield. He stood with his palm against the cold glass and looked at the back of her bowed head and thought, silently, words that were not a prayer of any order he knew. He thought that she had wept too. He thought that he had felt the tears on his face as he died, and they had been hers, and they had been real. He thought that whoever had taught her to be steady had not been able to teach her to be cold. He thought that whoever had taught her was therefore not finished with her, because a tool that still wept was a tool that might still be turned. He thought that he was going to take her back. Not from death, because he could not take her from death, but from whoever had her by the throat. After what he judged was half his shift, the door of the chapel opened. A figure entered. The figure wore a plain gray cloak with a deep hood. The figure walked across the chapel toward Lianna. The figure was tall and thin and moved with a quiet that, even at this distance, Aedan recognized as the quiet of someone who had been trained to move quietly for a very long time. Lianna did not look up at the figure. She had not heard the door. The figure stopped behind her. The figure lifted one hand, gloved in gray, and placed it on her shoulder. Lianna did not start at the touch. She knew the touch. She lifted her face from the helmet. Her eyes were dry. She had stopped weeping the moment the hand had touched her. The figure leaned down. The hood hid the face entirely. The hood hid it from any angle, including the angle of the Mirror of Worlds, and Aedan understood at once that this hiding was not natural. There was a working of concealment on the cloak. The Mirror of Worlds was a powerful instrument of the Seventh Circle, and the cloak resisted it. Whoever wore it had access to a magic older than Merva's mirror. The figure's gray hood moved close to Lianna's ear. The figure spoke. The mirror gave no sound. Aedan watched the lips of Lianna change as she listened. He watched her face go from grief to attention to something he could only describe as obedient grief, the face of a soldier receiving a new order from a beloved commander. The figure straightened. The hand left her shoulder. The figure turned and walked out of the chapel without ever showing its face. Lianna sat for a moment longer in front of the helmet. Then she stood. Her hand returned to the pommel of dawn. She walked out of the chapel toward the side door where her attendants waited. The mirror's view followed her for one more breath. Then the surface clouded gray again, and Aedan's shift was over. He stood for a long count with his hand still pressed to the cold glass. He had seen what he had come to see. He had seen more than he had come to see. He had seen the figure in the gray cloak. He had not seen the face. He had not needed to see the face to know two things. The figure was the same figure who had stood in the coral corridor 3 years ago and tasted the salt. The figure was the same figure who had been visiting Lianna for years, the figure that Aedan had only ever heard described in rumor and could now confirm. The puppeteer's hand had touched Lianna in the same hour he had been watching her. The puppeteer was real. The puppeteer was patient. The puppeteer had threads in both the surface and the lower circles. Aedan lowered his hand from the glass. He turned and walked to the chamber door, which opened for him at his approach. The attendant of dark glass was waiting in the corridor. She led him back to his quarters in silence. He did not speak to her. He did not speak to Shkvark when he reached his rooms. He sat on the bed of woven shadow. He looked at the floor for a long time. Then he stood. He went to the basin of clear water. He looked into it without expression, because he knew it was watching him. He thought, behind that expression, a single word in the old paladin tongue. The word was hold. He thought it 3 times. He thought it for Lianna. He thought it for himself. He thought it for the thing he had seen on the surface and was now going to climb the rest of the way to find. The 6th circle came to Aedan not through a door, but through a war. The war began 2 months after his first viewing in the Mirror of Worlds. The 6th circle was the Circle of Furnaces, ruled by an archdemon named Vorshal, who was a creature of pure heat and pure greed. And Vorshal had decided, in the 3rd year of Aedan's climb, to claim a province of the 7th that bordered his own territory. The province was a strip of orchards near the lift gates, valuable not for the fruit, but for the souls who tended them. Merva refused to give up the province. Vorshal marched. Merva called for her vassals to march in return. She also called for Aedan. She came to him in his quarters in the South Tower on the shift after the call to war. She did not sit. She stood in the middle of the room and told him that she was making him a captain of her army. She told him that the rank was provisional and that he would answer to her Duchess of War, but that the rank carried with it the right to absorb anything he killed on the battlefield. And the battlefield would contain demons of the 6th circle. Aedan understood the offer. Merva was giving him a path upward through her enemies. He accepted on the same shift. He marched out of the Petal Palace at the head of 300 Seventh Circle warriors and 4,000 levies from the orchards 3 days later. Shkvark marched beside him. Aedan had refused to leave the small imp behind. Shkvark had grown in the years since the Ashfields. He was no longer the smallest imp Aedan had ever seen. He was now a low warrior of his own, with proper claws and proper teeth, though still without a tail, and he carried a short curved blade that Aedan had given him on his second-year mark in Hell. He walked at Aedan's left shoulder the entire march. The battle came at a place called the Black Ford, a crossing of one of the slow black rivers of the Seventh, where Vorshal's furnace warriors had built a bridgehead of slag and bone. Aedan had read the reports of the Duchess of War during the march, and had concluded that the Duchess of War was an idiot. The Duchess of War planned to assault the bridgehead directly with the heavy infantry of the Seventh, which was elegant and traditional, and would have cost her 2,000 levies. Aedan asked the Duchess in private if she would consider a flanking maneuver up the river. The Duchess told him that flanking was the tactic of cowards, and that the Seventh did not flank. Aedan bowed and accepted her order. Then, on the night before the battle, he took his own 300 warriors and 4,000 levies off the main road and marched them up the riverbank in the dark. He did this without informing the Duchess. He calculated that if he succeeded, the Duchess would take the credit. If he failed, he would be dead, and the Duchess would still have her main force. The Duchess would not lose either way. Aedan would either rise or be done with rising. He flanked the bridgehead at dawn of the battle. Vorshal's furnace warriors were facing the Duchess's main assault when Aedan's column hit them in the rear. The bridgehead collapsed in the first hour. Vorshal himself had not been at the Black Ford, but his lieutenant, a six-circle lord named Brackhall of the Forge, was. Aedan found Brackhall in the burning rubble of the slag bridge. Brackhall was twice his size. Brackhall carried a hammer that was a single piece of cooled lava as long as a man. Brackhall saw Aedan coming through the smoke and laughed and swung the hammer in a low arc designed to break Aedan's legs. Aedan did not think a single word. He had decided on the march that he would save his prayers for the kill itself. He let the hammer come. He stepped inside its arc the way he had once stepped inside the arc of a fourth circle archdemon's tail when he was 44. The hammer passed behind him and tore a piece out of the slag bridge. Brackhall was off balance for one breath. Aedan thought the word Lux and the word Farum together and drove his shoulder into Brackhall's exposed armpit. The sixth circle lord's plate cracked at the joint. Aedan drove his hand into the crack. His hand found the bundle of muscle and demonic vein at the inside of the shoulder. He tore it. Brackhall screamed. Aedan was already moving. He climbed the bigger demon's chest like a man climbing a wall, hooked one curved horn over Brackhall's lower jaw, and tore the jaw off. Brackhall fell. Aedan put his mouth to the wound. He drank. Brackhall's life went into him in a flood that was hotter than anything he had absorbed before, because the sixth circle was a circle of heat, and Aedan's body burned from the inside for a count of 30 as it accepted the new weight. He grew. He grew the way the pit warden's death had grown him, but more so. By the end of the absorption, he was nearly 9 feet tall, and his skin had gone from ash to a darker stone gray with bands of red showing through. And his horns had curved into the heavy spirals of a sixth circle warrior. The silver in his eyes brightened until even the demons of his own side were afraid to look at him. The Duchess of War arrived at the bridgehead an hour later. She saw what Aedan had done. She took the credit. Aedan let her. The reports that went back to Merva named the Duchess as the hero of the Black Ford, and Aedan as her competent captain. Merva read the reports and laughed for a full afternoon in her glass throne room, because Merva had spies of her own and knew exactly who had flanked at the Black Ford. She summoned Aedan back to court. She made him a Marquis of the Seventh Circle by personal decree, which skipped him 3 normal ranks. She held a feast in his honor. At the feast, she leaned to him during the 3rd course and asked him, quietly, whether he would consider taking the Duchess of War's position when the Duchess of War next failed at something. Aedan said that he would consider it. He did not need to consider it. He knew that the Duchess of War would fail at something within the year, because Manhwa would arrange it. He also knew that he would not be the Duchess of War for long. The 6th circle was still above him, and the war was not over. Vorshul was a patient enemy. He filed the rank. He took the 2nd viewing in the mirror that Manhwa granted him as a reward for the Black Ford, off schedule on the same shift as the feast. He saw Lianna again. She was at her desk in the cathedral. She was writing. The desk was piled with parchments. There was an empty bottle of wine beside her hand. There was a 2nd bottle, half full. Her hair had a thread of gray in it that had not been there 2 months before. The gray cloaked figure was not with her this time. She wrote for the entire shift. Aedan watched her hand move across the page. The hand was still steady. He understood at the end of the shift that she was writing a chronicle. She was writing the history of the Order under her own grand mastership. She was leaving a record. He understood without surprise that she did not expect to live long. The next 2 years were war. Vorshul did not give up the orchards after the Black Ford. He sent 3 more armies. Manhwa sent 3 more armies back. The border between the 7th and 6th became a permanent line of slag and bone. Aedan fought in 9 major engagements and 27 smaller ones. He killed 42 6th Circle lords in those engagements. He absorbed 31 of them. The other 11 were absorbed by demons of his own side who had earned the right to a share. By the end of the 2nd year of war, he was the highest-ranking field commander in Manhwa's armies, and the largest demon in her court. He was 11 feet tall. His skin was a deep gray that took red bands when he was angry. His horns curled back over his skull in heavy spirals. The silver in his eyes had thickened from a ring to a quarter of the iris, and demons of the 6th Circle had begun to call him the Silver-Eyed One on the battlefield, which was meant as an insult and which Aedan accepted as a fact. He did not feel like the same person who had stepped off the lift in the 8th Circle. He noticed this in the small hours between battles. He noticed that the things he absorbed were no longer always neutral inside him. Brackhall of the Forge had brought him pride. A 6th Circle lord named Iskar the Iron had brought him a taste for command. A duchess of the 6th Circle he had killed in the 7th engagement, named Velumara, had brought him a low, constant hunger for finer things. Fine wine, fine cloth, fine company, which Aedan had to fight down every morning. He fought it down by thinking the silent prayer. The silent prayer cost him more now than it had in the 9th Circle. It cost him the inside of his mouth. He had a scar that ran from his teeth down to his stomach, a permanent black line of burned flesh that never fully healed. He paid the cost without complaint. The prayer was the only thing that kept the absorbed personalities from running together. Without it, he would have been a demon called Corvax, with a memory of being a man called Aedan. With it, he was Aedan in the body of Corvax, with the strengths of 31 6th Circle lords serving as his weapons. He noticed something else. He noticed that he had stopped thinking the full dawn prayer at all. He thought single lines. He thought single words. He had not run the prayer from start to end since the salt-walled room in the 8th Circle. He told himself this was because the price had grown too high. He told himself this was practical. He told himself this and did not believe himself. He also did not start praying the full prayer again. He could not afford the cost. He noticed that not being able to afford a cost was the kind of thought a demon thought. Not a paladin. He filed the noticing. He kept fighting. In the middle of the second year of war, Shkvark died. It happened at a small engagement at a place called the Burning Ford, 3 months upriver from the Black Ford, where Vorshal had sent a column of fast raiders to slip behind Merva's lines and attack the orchards directly. Aedan's flying column had intercepted them at the ford. The fight had been short and ugly. Aedan had killed the raider captain personally. The raider captain had thrown a knife as he died. The knife had been aimed at Aedan's throat. Shkvark had stepped in front of it. The knife had taken Shkvark below the collarbone, in the place where Aedan had taught him over 4 years that a 6th circle blade would do the most damage to a 9th circle body. Shkvark had stood for 2 breaths after the knife went in. Then he had fallen at Aedan's feet. Aedan had killed the raider captain a second time, more thoroughly. Then he had knelt by Shkvark. Shkvark was still breathing. His pale eyes were open. He looked up at Aedan and said in the broken speech of the 9th circle that he was sorry he had not been faster. Aedan said in the same broken speech that Shkvark had been fast enough. Shkvark said that he had a request. Aedan said he would grant it. Shkvark said that he wanted to be buried. He had heard in his time in the 8th that on the surface the dead were buried, and he wanted to know what that felt like. Aedan said he would do it. Shkvark closed his eyes. He stopped breathing 2 breaths later. Aedan did not absorb him. He had absorbed 1,000 demons by that point in his climb, and the small ribbon of life inside Shkvark would have made him grow not at all. He could not have justified it. He also would not have done it if it had grown him by a circle. He picked Shkvark up. He carried him from the burning ford back to a small hill near Merva's territory that the orchards did not reach. He dug the grave with his own hands. The earth of the 7th circle was hard, but Aedan's hands were the hands of a 6th circle warrior now, and they tore through the rock as if it were wet clay. He made the grave deep. He laid Shkvark in it. He placed the small curved blade he had given him on his chest. He stood over the grave. He did something he had not done in 5 years. He thought the full dawn prayer from start to end. The price was every soft tissue in his mouth and a portion of his lungs. He fell to his knees during the 3rd stanza, coughing dark blood. He did not stop. He finished the prayer. He finished it for Shkvark, who had had no part of any order of the Silver Dawn, and who had also had no part of any circle of hell except the one he had been born into, and who had stood between a knife and a man who remembered being a man. When the prayer was done, Aedan was lying on his side beside the grave. He could not move for an hour. He could not have spoken if anyone had asked him to. He could only think. He thought that Shkvark had been the only demon in 5 years of climb who had not betrayed him. He thought that this was a record Shkvark would hold forever, because Aedan was unlikely to find another. He filled in the grave when he could move again. He stood over it for a long time. Then he walked back to his command. He did not tell anyone where he had been. He returned to the war. He fought 11 more major engagements in the next year. He killed 19 more 6th circle lords. At the end of the 3rd year of war, Vorshal himself came to the front, and Merva sent Aedan to meet him. Vorshal, archdemon of the 6th circle, was a creature of fused iron and living fire. He stood 20 feet tall. His skin was not skin, but plates of black iron that glowed orange at the seams. His face was a mask of the same iron, with 2 slits for eyes and a horizontal slit for a mouth. And behind the slits was fire. He carried no weapon. His hands were weapon enough. He met Aedan on a plain of fused glass, 3 days' march from the Black Ford. He had brought no army. He had come alone. He had sent a message to Merva on the shift before that he wished to settle the border by personal combat, in the old way, between her best commander and himself. Merva had laughed when she read the message. Then she had stopped laughing, because she had understood what the message meant. The sixth circle was tired of the war. Vorshal was tired of the war. Vorshal was offering a way to end it that did not cost him face. If his commander, meaning Aedan, won, the orchards stayed with the seventh, and Vorshal withdrew with honor because he had fought personally. If Vorshal won, the orchards went to the sixth, and Merva would have to find a new marquis. Either way, the war ended. Merva had told Aedan in the briefing that she was sending him because she had no one else who could possibly win. She had also told him that if he died at Vorshal's hands, she would not consider it a failure, but a sacrifice for which she would honor his memory in the seventh tower of her palace, which was the tower where the names of Merva's dead favorites were inscribed in dark glass. Aedan had thanked her for the honor and asked permission to take his own kit to the plane of fused glass. He had not brought paladin kit. He had brought instead 3 small things. A piece of cured skin on which he had written a single word in the old paladin tongue. A small flask of black water from the basin in his quarters, which he had stolen over the months at the cost of his own caution. A short blade of fused glass that he had made himself from a fragment of Brakhal's hammer, sharpened against 3 years of stones. Merva had asked what the flask was for. He had told her it was for drinking. She had not pressed. The plane of fused glass was empty when Aedan arrived. The fused glass underfoot was black with veins of red running through it, and it reflected the red ceiling of the sixth circle in a way that made the entire plane look like a sea of slow fire. Vorshal stood at the center. The 2 of them were the only living things in the visible world. Aedan walked toward him. He stopped at a distance of 10 paces. He bowed at the angle of a marquis of the seventh to an archdemon of the sixth, which was almost to the ground. He straightened. He waited. Vorshal did not bow. Vorshal did not need to. Vorshal said, in a voice that was the sound of metal heated past tolerance, that he had heard the name Corvax of the Eighth from many sources, including some sources who would not normally speak to a sixth circle archdemon. Vorshal said that he had been told that Corvax was a fallen paladin. Vorshal said that he did not particularly believe it. Vorshal said that he had come to see for himself. Aedan said in his own voice, which was now deep and rough and carried the weight of his absorptions, that Vorshal would see what he would see. Vorshal laughed. The laugh was the sound of an iron pot cracking. Then Vorshal moved. The fight was the longest of Aedan's career in hell. It lasted 3 full shifts. Vorshal did not tire. Vorshal did not bleed in any normal sense. When Aedan cut him, fire came out, and the iron sealed itself behind the cut. Aedan's fused glass blade broke against the iron in the first hour. After that, Aedan fought with his hands. He had absorbed 31 sixth circle lords. He had a working knowledge of where the seams in such iron were thinnest. He went for those seams. He broke 2 of them. Fire came out of both. Vorshal did not slow. Vorshal broke Aedan's left arm in the second shift. Vorshal broke 3 of Aedan's ribs in the same shift. Vorshal tore one of Aedan's horns off in the third. Aedan did not slow either. He had absorbed 31 sixth circle lords. Their pain tolerance was now his pain tolerance. He thought a single word of the dawn prayer for every blow he took and for every blow he gave. The inside of his mouth, what was left of it, was a single sheet of pain. He did not notice the pain. He had reached the place beyond noticing in the second hour. In the middle of the third shift, Aedan understood that he could not kill Vorshal by ordinary means. He had absorbed enough sixth circle lords to know that the iron skin of an archdemon was a function of the archdemon's connection to the furnace beneath the sixth circle, and the connection could not be cut by hands or blades. The connection could only be cut by something that did not belong to the sixth circle at all. Aedan had brought something. He drew the small flask of black water from inside his armor. He uncorked it with his teeth. He drank it. The water was not black water. The water was the water of his own basin in the south tower of the Petal Palace. The water had been listening to him for 3 years. The water had absorbed every prayer he had thought silently in front of it, every line of the dawn prayer he had thought in the long shifts of his planning, every word in the old paladin tongue he had spoken to himself in his head. The water carried more prayer than any demon had ever swallowed at once. He had stolen it, knowing what it would do to him. He drank it anyway. The prayer entered him from the inside. The pain was so great that he could not stand for a count of 3. He went to his knees. His skin began to smoke. The inside of his ribs began to glow. The silver in his eyes spread until the demonic black was almost gone, until his eyes were 2 pure points of silver light in a face that was still demonic gray. Vorshal stopped advancing. Vorshal had never seen this before. No one had ever seen this before. Aedan stood up. He walked toward Vorshal on legs that should not have been able to hold him. He raised his right hand, the unbroken one, and he placed it against Vorshal's chest plate. He thought, not spoke, but thought 3 words of the dawn prayer at the level of full sincerity, the level he had not used since the cathedral. The 3 words went out of his hand into Vorshal's chest. The iron plate did not crack. The iron plate melted. The fire behind the iron plate went out. Aedan reached through the hole his 3 words had made. He found inside Vorshal a thing that was not flesh and not iron, a small dark coal the size of a fist, which was Vorshal's connection to the furnace of the 6th circle. He took the coal in his hand. He pulled it out. Vorshal fell. Aedan held the coal. The coal was burning his hand to the bone, but it was burning slowly because the coal recognized something in him that was older than the 6th circle. He put the coal in his mouth. He swallowed it. Vorshal's life and Vorshal's connection to the furnace and the entire 6th circle's relationship to the 6th circle's archdemon poured into Aedan in a flood that no demon was ever supposed to absorb. He grew on the spot. He grew 6 feet in a single count. His skin went from gray to a deep black, with bands of orange running through it. His remaining horn doubled in length. The horn that had been torn off grew back, longer than before. He stood at the end of the absorption, nearly 18 feet tall. He stood on the plane of fused glass alone. There was no body of Vorshal. The body had burned up in the absorption. There was only Aedan and the silence of an entire circle that had just lost its archdemon. He stood for a long count. He understood that he was now, in functional terms, the archdemon of the 6th circle. He understood that this would not last, because there were forces in the 6th circle and elsewhere that would not accept it, and because he had used up something inside himself to win, and because Velyar of the 9th was certainly watching. He understood also that he had skipped the 5th circle entirely. He had gone in 3 shifts from a Marquis of the 7th to an archdemon by absorption. The bureaucracy of hell would catch up with him eventually. For one moment, on a plane of fused glass under a red ceiling, he stood as a fallen paladin who had become the temporary master of the 6th circle. He thought of Lianna. He thought of Shkvark. He thought of the gray-cloaked figure. He started walking back toward Merva's territory because the war was over and because he needed to use the Mirror of Worlds one more time before Velyar came down to take from him what he had just taken from Vorshal. Aedan reached Merva's palace on the 2nd shift after the plane of fused glass. He did not go to her audience hall. He went directly to the chamber of the Mirror of Worlds. The attendants did not stop him. The attendants had heard what had happened. The attendant stepped aside as if he were a passing fire. The chamber was empty when he entered. The mirror was waiting. He stood in front of it. He did not have to hold Lianna's face in mind this time. The mirror knew. The surface clouded and cleared. He saw a room he had never seen before. It was a small bedroom in what looked like a private wing of the cathedral complex. The room had stone walls and a narrow window and a bed with white linens. Lianna was in the bed. She was thin. She was very thin. Her hair was entirely gray. Her face had the look of a woman in her late 60s, though Aedan calculated that she should have been only 50. She was awake. She was sitting up against the pillows. There was a cup of water on the small table beside her. There was a younger paladin sitting in a chair by the bed, a woman with brown hair who Aedan did not recognize, who was reading aloud from a book. Lianna was listening with her eyes closed. The mirror showed him no sound. He watched her listen. He watched her breathe. He watched the slow rise and fall of the white linens over her chest, which was uneven, the breath of a body that was tired in a way that did not get better with sleep. He watched her open her eyes and smile at the younger paladin and put one thin hand on the younger paladin's wrist. The younger paladin smiled back and continued reading. After a measure, the younger paladin closed the book and stood and bowed and left. Lianna was alone. She lay back against the pillows. She closed her eyes. Aedan stood in the chamber and watched her sleep. He had absorbed an archdemon of the 6th circle on the previous shift. He had become a thing nearly 18 feet tall. He felt, watching Lianna in the bed, the same size he had been when he had woken in the ash fields. He felt small. He was about to step back from the mirror when the door of Lianna's room opened. The figure entered. The gray cloak, the deep hood, the walk of the trained quiet. Aedan went very still. The figure walked to the chair the younger paladin had vacated. The figure sat down. The figure lowered the hood. Aedan saw the face. It was a face he knew. It was a face he had bowed to 1,000 times in his life above. It was a face he had served with every breath of his 30 years as a paladin. It was the face of the god Aedan, the god of light, the patron of the Order of the Silver Dawn, the being to whom Aedan had prayed every morning and every night of his adult life until the moment Lianna had killed him. Aedan was a man of perhaps 40, with brown hair and a short brown beard and gray eyes. The eyes were the same gray as Lianna's eyes. Aedan had never noticed this before. He noticed it now. Aedan leaned forward in the chair. He took Lianna's thin hand in both of his. He spoke. The mirror gave no sound. Lianna opened her eyes and looked at him without surprise. She knew him. She had known him for what Aedan now understood had been her entire life. Aedan spoke for a long time. Lianna listened. She did not weep. She did not protest. She only listened, with the same face of obedient grief Aedan had seen the first time. Then she spoke. She said something. Aedan answered. She said something else. Aedan lifted her hand and pressed it to his cheek for a moment. Then he released it. He stood. He bent down and kissed her forehead. He pulled the hood back over his face. He walked out of the room. Lianna lay still for a count. Then she turned her face toward the wall. She wept silently. The mirror's view followed her for one more breath. Then the surface clouded gray. Aedan did not move from the chamber for an hour. He stood in front of the gray surface with both hands at his sides, and he understood. He understood everything. He understood that the god of light had visited Lianna for years because Lianna had been the god's own instrument from the beginning. He understood that the steady hand on the hilt of dawn had been steadied by 30 years of preparation by the god to whom Aedan had prayed every day. He understood that the tears had been real because Lianna had loved Aedan, and that the strike had been perfect because Aedan had trained her to it, and that both of these things had been true at once because Aedan was a god and had used love as a tool. He understood that he had not been killed by jealousy or by political intrigue or by demonic interference. He had been killed by the God of Light himself, deliberately, in order to send a paladin to hell who would climb. He understood that he was that paladin. He understood that the climb itself was the plan. He understood that whatever the God of Light wanted him to do at the top of the climb was a thing the God of Light could not do alone. He stood with this understanding for the full hour. He did not move. He did not weep, because his eyes had moved past weeping in the burial of Shkvark. He did not pray, because he no longer knew which prayer he would speak to a God who had killed him through the hands of the woman he loved. At the end of the hour, he turned from the mirror and walked out of the chamber. Merva was waiting for him in the corridor. She had not been invited. She had come because she had felt the mirror's prolonged use through the working of her own palace. She looked at his face. She did not ask him what he had seen. She told him instead that Velyar of the Ninth had sent an emissary to the gates of her palace, and that the emissary was waiting in her audience hall, and that the emissary had requested an audience specifically with Lord Corvax of the Sixth Circle, who had once been Lord Corvax of the Eighth, and who before that had been an imp of the Ninth, and who before that had been a paladin on the surface. The emissary had used all 4 titles in his request. Aedan understood that Velyar had been watching even more closely than he had assumed. He told Merva he would see the emissary at once. He went to the audience hall. The emissary was a tall demon of the Ninth Circle Aedan recognized. It was Vosik, his old clerk. Vosik had risen too in the years of Aedan's climb. Vosik now wore the robes of an archdemon's personal scribe. Vosik bowed to Aedan at the angle of an old colleague greeting a new equal. Vosik said in the formal speech of the Ninth that Lord Velyar of the Ninth Circle had sent his personal greetings to Lord Corvax of the Sixth, and that Lord Velyar wished to extend an invitation to Lord Corvax to descend, freely and without challenge, to the throne hall of the First Circle, where Lord Velyar was currently in residence as the senior archdemon of all hell. Aedan said in the formal speech that he was honored by the invitation. He asked Vosik why Lord Velyar was in residence in the First Circle when his proper throne was in the Ninth. Vosik smiled, the same soundless smile of the old Ashfield's clerk, now grown into the smile of an archdemon's scribe. Vosik said that Lord Velyar had been in residence in the First Circle for 500 years, and that the throne of the Ninth was a fiction maintained for the benefit of the demons of the Ninth, and that the true seat of betrayal in all of hell was and had always been the First Circle, where the betrayal began. Aedan filed this. He had suspected, he had not known. He asked Vosik what the audience would contain. Vosik said in his old clerk's voice, the voice he had used in the Ashfields, that the audience would contain the truth. That Lord Velyar had waited for it for 500 years. That Lord Corvax was the first paladin who had earned the right to hear it. Aedan said he would come. Vosik bowed. Vosik left. Aedan stood alone in the audience hall of the Petal Palace of the Seventh Circle. He thought of Lianna in the bed with the white linens. He thought of Aaron in the chair. He thought of Shkvark in the grave on the small hill. He thought of his own hand on the cold surface of the mirror in the chamber outside. He understood that he was going to descend, or rather ascend, to the First Circle, where the senior archdemon of all hell waited to tell him the truth, and that the truth would not be a comfort. He turned to Merva, who had followed him into the audience hall and was standing near the dark glass throne with her arms crossed. He told her that he was leaving her court. He told her that he was grateful. He told her that he would not be returning. Merva inclined her head. She did not protest. She told him that the 7th tower of her palace would carry his name in dark glass, regardless of whether he returned, because he had ended the war with the 6th, And that was a service that did not require survival. Aedan bowed to her, at the angle of a marquis of her court to his archdemoness, which was almost to the ground. He left the palace on the same shift. The road from the 7th circle to the 1st was not the slow upward climb Aedan had expected. Vosik took him through the back passages of hell, the intercircle corridors used only by archdemons and their highest scribes, which bypassed the lift gates and the registries and the long bureaucratic ascents. They walked for 3 shifts. They passed through a corridor of mirrors that showed Aedan on every wall, every version of himself he had been over 20 years. The imp with the rusted knife, the low servant of the ash fields, the lord of the pits, the master of mining, the marquis of the orchards, the commander of armies, the thing that had drunk the furnace of the 6th. Aedan did not look at any of them long. He had been all of them. He was none of them now. He was something the corridor had no mirror for. They passed through a corridor of voices that whispered the names of the 12 paladins who had come before him. Aedan listened to the names as they walked. He did not recognize any of them. He had not been told their names by anyone in hell or on the surface, because none of them had survived to be remembered above. He counted the names anyway, all 12, and committed them to memory. He thought it was the least he owed them. They came at last to the gates of the 1st circle. The gates were not gates. They were a single open arch in a wall of black stone that ran across the world. Beyond the arch was a hall. The hall was wider than the cathedral on the surface and longer than the road from one end of his old kingdom to the other. The floor was polished obsidian. The ceiling, far above, was a vault of slow stars. There were no other demons in the hall. There were only the long obsidian floor and the slow stars, and at the far end, a throne. The throne was made of bone. It was a small throne. It was the size of an ordinary chair. The being who sat on it was not large. The being was the size of a tall man. Aedan walked the length of the hall. He counted his steps. He had counted his steps in the ash fields on his first day. He counted them now. He stopped 10 paces from the throne. He bowed. He did not know the proper angle for a fallen paladin who had absorbed an archdemon to bow to the senior archdemon of all hell. He bowed at the angle of a grand master of the Order of the Silver Dawn to a king of the surface, because that was a bow he knew. He straightened. The being on the throne looked at him. The being was Velyar of the 9th, of the 1st, of all betrayal. He was a thin man with long black hair and a face that was almost human. His eyes were the color of old pearls. His hands were folded in his lap. He wore a simple robe of unwoven hunger. He looked tired. Velyar said in a voice that was quiet and ordinary that Aedan was welcome. He said he had waited 20 years. He said he had thought, for the first 100 days, that Aedan would die in the ash fields, and he had been prepared to write that off as a wasted investment. He said that on the 101st day, he had decided to invest more. He said that every shift of Aedan's climb since then had been watched and not interfered with, and that this restraint had cost him allies. He said he was glad it had not been wasted. Aedan said in his own quiet voice that he had been told he would hear the truth. He asked if he could hear it now. Velyar smiled. The smile was small and ordinary and tired. Velyar said the truth was not long. Velyar said that the Order of the Silver Dawn had been founded 1,000 years ago by Velyar himself. The order had been built as a factory for paladins who, when killed in the proper way at the proper moment by the proper hand, would fall into hell rather than rise, and would carry their training and their faith and their memory of the surface into the lower circles, where they would climb. Velyar had wanted, 1,000 years ago, a paladin who could stand at his side as an equal, because Veliar had been lonely. The first 3 paladins had not survived the climb. They had been broken in the lower circles before they had reached the 5th. Veliar had refined the process. The 4th and 5th had reached the 3rd. The 6th had reached the 2nd. The 7th through the 11th had reached the 1st, but had each gone mad on arrival because they had climbed without knowing they were climbing toward Veliar, and the discovery had broken them. The 12th had reached the 1st Sane, but had refused to listen to Veliar's truth and had attacked him, and Veliar had killed him with regret. Aedan was the 13th. Veliar said that the order had been taken from him 300 years into its existence. The god of light, Aeron, had infiltrated the order through a series of carefully placed bishops and had reoriented it toward the surface, away from its true purpose. The order's paladins now believed they served the gods of light. Most of them did. The training, however, had not changed. The order still produced paladins who could fall and climb. Aeron had realized this 2 centuries ago. Aeron had begun to use the order for his own purposes. Aeron had wanted, like Veliar, a fallen paladin, but Aeron had wanted one for a different reason. Veliar said that Aeron and he had been playing a game for 500 years. The game was a stalemate. They could not kill each other. They could not directly interfere in each other's spheres. They could only move pieces. Aedan had been Aeron's piece. The plan had been to send Aedan to hell, trained, capable, and bound by grief to climb. And at the top, when Aedan reached the 1st circle, Aedan would kill Veliar with the silent prayer Aedan had practiced for 20 years. That was the plan. Aeron had selected Lianna at the age of 4. Aeron had visited her once a year through her childhood. Aeron had arranged her placement in the order. Aeron had ensured that Aedan met her at 14 and trained her. Aeron had ensured that Aedan loved her. Aeron had whispered to her on her 16th birthday and on every birthday after that she would one day be given a task that would cost her everything, and that she would perform it because she loved her master more than her own life. Lianna had performed the task. Lianna had not known the full purpose. Lianna had known only that the god she served had asked it, and that the man she loved would, somehow, somewhere, somewhen, be served by her doing it. She had believed this because Aeron was a god, and she had been raised from the age of 4 to believe him. Veliar said that Aedan had now climbed. Veliar said that the plan had worked, almost entirely. The only thing the plan had not predicted was that Aedan would not break, and that Aedan would not arrive at the 1st circle ready to kill Veliar on sight. Veliar said that this was because Veliar had made one move of his own. The move had been to allow Aedan's climb to be slow enough that Aedan would have time to think. Aeron had wanted the climb to be fast and grief-driven. Veliar had slowed it. Veliar had been the one who had sent the gray-cloaked inspector to the 8th circle, not to threaten Aedan, but to confirm for Aedan that there were threads in the lower circles that Aedan did not yet understand. Veliar had been the one who had ensured that Merva would find Aedan interesting, and that Merva would offer him the Mirror of Worlds. Veliar had wanted Aedan to see Aeron's face. Veliar had wanted Aedan to arrive in the 1st circle, knowing that Aeron was the one who had killed him, not Veliar. Aedan listened to all of this without moving. He understood every word. He had suspected most of it. The new information was small. The new information was that he had been Veliar's piece as well as Aeron's, and that the 2 gods of light and dark had each been moving him, and that he had not been a paladin or a demon at any point in his 20 years, but a piece on a board larger than both. He thought of Lianna. He thought of the bed with the white linens. He thought of Aeron leaning down to kiss her forehead. He thought of the small, thin hand pressed to a cheek that had used her since she was 4. Veliar said quietly that he understood Aedan had a choice to make. Veliar said that Aedan could still do what Aeron had sent him to do. Aedan could speak the silent prayer aloud, and Veliar would die, and Aeron's plan would be complete. Velyar said he would not stop Aedan. He had decided in the last 20 years that if Aedan came to that decision freely after hearing the truth, then Velyar would accept the outcome. Velyar was tired. Velyar said the alternative was that Aedan could stand with him, not for him, with him, against Aeron, against the gods of light who had built and stolen the Order and used 12 paladins as wasted pieces and used a 13th paladin's love as a knife. Velyar said that he could not promise Aedan vengeance. He could only promise Aedan the chance to climb back to the surface and to face Aeron with whatever weapon Aedan could bring. Aedan stood for a long count in the obsidian hall. He thought of every face he had carried for 20 years. Lianna's, Shkvark's, Vossic's, Brune's, Merva's, the faces of the 31 Sixth Circle Lords, the faces of the 12 paladins he had memorized in the Corridor of Voices. He thought of his own face, which he had not seen in any true mirror for 20 years, which was a face of demonic gray and curved horns and silver eyes that no longer had any black in them at all. He stepped forward. He stopped 3 paces from the throne. He opened his mouth. The inside of his mouth was a single scar. He spoke. He did not speak the silent prayer. He spoke the dawn prayer aloud, the full one, from start to end, for the first time in 20 years. The hall shook. The slow stars of the ceiling went out. The obsidian floor cracked from the throne to the arch in a single line. The 9 circles of hell felt it. Half the imps of the lower circles died where they stood. 3 of the surviving archdemons of the upper circles fell to their knees in their own palaces. Vossic, who had been listening from the archway, dropped his scrolls and laughed and wept at once, because Vossic had been a clerk of the Ashfields once and had not heard a true prayer in 700 years. The prayer burned Aedan's tongue from his mouth. It burned his lungs from his chest. It burned the inside of his ribs to ash. He finished it. He stood at the end of it with his tongue gone and his lungs gone and his chest a cavity of slow gray fire that should have killed any creature in any world. He did not die. The fire stayed in his chest. It did not consume him further. It became part of him. He understood, standing in the cracked obsidian hall, that he had paid the price of the prayer with everything in him that was still flesh, and that what was left of him was no longer flesh at all. He was a body of gray fire, shaped like an 18-foot demon with silver eyes. He was a fallen paladin who had become a prayer. He was the thing both Aeron and Velyar had been trying to make for 1,000 years. He was the thing neither of them had expected. He looked at Velyar. Velyar was on his knees in front of the throne. Velyar was not dead. Velyar was looking up at him with the same tired, ordinary face, but with tears running down it. Velyar said, in a voice that was almost a whisper, that he had not believed it would actually happen. Velyar said that Aedan had not killed him. Aedan said, through the cavity where his mouth had been, that he had not come to kill Velyar. He said the words in a voice that was not sound but pressure, the way a prayer could be heard without being said. He said he had come to make his choice. He said he chose the surface. He said he chose to walk out of the first circle and through the upper gates and onto the world of his birth, and to find the God of light, and to ask Aeron face to face why. Velyar said that he would not stop him. Velyar said that he would, if Aedan permitted, accompany him to the gates. Aedan said that he permitted. He turned. He walked the length of the hall back toward the arch, with Velyar walking 3 paces behind him. Vossic fell in behind Velyar. The 3 of them passed under the arch. They walked back through the corridor of voices. The voices of the 12 paladins said his name as he passed, all 12 of them at once, in 12 different tongues. They walked through the corridor of mirrors. None of the mirrors showed him a reflection now, because he was no longer any of the things they had shown before. They walked up through the intercircle passages. They reached the upper gates of the first circle, which were the gates that opened onto the surface and which had not been opened in 500 years. Velyar lifted his hand. The gates opened. Light came in. Not the red light of hell, the yellow light of a true sun, the light of the surface. Aedan stepped through the gates. He came out on a hillside under an open sky. It was morning. The grass was green. The air smelled of summer earth and distant water. He had not smelled grass in 20 years. The light of the sun struck his gray fire body, and the gray fire began to smoke at once, because the sun of the surface was a thing the bodies of hell were not made to bear. He kept walking. He did not stop for the smoke. He had a destination. The destination was a small graveyard half a mile down the hill, where he could see, even from this distance, a white stone cross, and beneath it, a recent grave. He walked toward it. Velyar and Vosik stayed at the gates behind him. They did not follow him into the sun. The gates closed when he was 100 paces past them. He reached the graveyard alone. He stood at the white stone cross. The cross bore Lianna's name. The grave beneath it was fresh. It had been dug perhaps a month before by his calculation of the seasons. He knelt. He could still kneel. He placed his hand on the earth above her. He thought, because he could no longer speak with the mouth he had burned away, 3 things in the silence of his own head. He thought that he knew. He thought that he was not angry. He thought that it had not been her. He felt the earth above the grave warm under his hand. He did not know if she heard. He hoped. He stood. He looked at the cross. He stood for a long time. Then he reached down and he opened the grave with his hand, slowly and without violence, the way a man might open a letter from someone he loved. The earth parted easily. The coffin came up. He opened the coffin. Lianna lay in it. Her body was old and thin. Her hair was gray. Her hand was on the hilt of the sword Dawn, which had been laid in the coffin with her, because she had asked for it before she died. The hand was still steady. He looked at the hand. He took the sword from it gently. The hilt of Dawn knew him. Dawn had been forged for the Grand Master of the Order. Dawn had been the sword in his hand for 15 years. Dawn ignited the moment his gray fire fingers closed on its grip. The fire of the sword was white. The fire of his hand was gray. The 2 fires fought each other. The grip burned his fingers to the bone. He did not let go. He held Dawn through the burning. The 2 fires settled, after a count of 9, into a single flame that was neither white nor gray, but a color that had not existed in either world before. He stood with the sword in his hand. He looked down at Lianna's face. He bent and kissed her forehead the way he had wanted to 1,000 times in 30 years and had never done, because she had been his student and then his peer, and never, in any time he had let himself acknowledge, anything more. He closed the coffin. He lowered it back into the earth. He covered it. He stood at the grave. He turned. On the horizon, to the east, was the cathedral of the Order of the Silver Dawn. The sun was rising behind it. Somewhere inside it, by Aedan's calculation of the politics of the surface, was a figure in a gray cloak waiting for the new Grand Master to be confirmed in Lianna's place. The figure was Aeron. Aedan started walking. The grass burned under his feet. The sun burned the gray fire of his body. Dawn burned in his hand. He did not slow. He had been a Grand Master and a paladin and an imp and a clerk's mark and a lord and a master and a marquis and a commander and the temporary archdemon of the 6th circle and the body of a prayer. He was none of them now.